Hello. Tonight, we begin with the most fascinating fairy tale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Prince Fickle and Fair Helena. There was once upon a time a beautiful girl called Helena. Her own mother had died when she was quite a child, and her stepmother was as cruel and unkind to her as she could be. Helena did all she could to gain her love, and performed the heavy work given her to do cheerfully and well. But her stepmother's heart wasn't in the least touched, and the more the poor girl did, the more she asked her to do. One day, she gave Helena 12 pounds of mixed feathers and bade her separate them all before evening, threatening her with heavy punishment if she failed to do so. The poor child sat down to her task with her eyes so full of tears that she could hardly see to begin. And when she had made one little heap of feathers, she sighed so deeply that they all blew apart again. And so it went on, and the poor girl grew more and more miserable. She bowed her head in her hands and cried, "Is there no one under heaven who will take pity on me?" Suddenly, a soft voice replied, "Be comforted, my child. I have come to help you." Terrified to death, Helena looked up and saw a fairy standing in front of her, who asked in the kindest way possible, "Why are you crying, my dear?" Helena, who for long had heard no friendly voice, confided her sad tale of woe to the fairy, and told her what the new task she had been given to do was, and how she despaired of ever accomplishing it. "Don't worry yourself about it any more," said the kind fairy. "Lie down and go to sleep, and I'll see that your work is done all right." So Helena lay down, and when she awoke, all the feathers were sorted into little bundles. But when she turned to thank the good fairy, she had vanished. In the evening, her stepmother returned, and was much amazed to find Helena sitting quietly with her work all finished before her. She praised her diligence, but at the same time racked her brain as to what harder task she could set her to do. The next day, she told Helena to empty a pond near the house with a spoon, which was full of holes. Helena set to work at once, but she very soon found that what her stepmother had told her to do was an impossibility. Full of despair and misery, she was in the act of throwing the spoon away, when suddenly the kind fairy stood before her again and asked her why she was so unhappy. When Helena told her of her stepmother's new demand, she said, "Trust to me, and I will do your task for you. Lie down and have a sleep in the meantime." Helena was comforted and lay down, and before you would have believed it possible, the fairy roused her gently and told her the pond was empty. Full of joy and gratitude, Helena hurried to her stepmother, hoping that now at last her heart would be softened towards her. But the wicked woman was furious at the frustration of her own evil designs, and only thought of what harder thing she could set the girl to do. Next morning, she ordered her to build before evening a beautiful castle, and to furnish it all from garret to basement. Helena sat down on the rocks which had been pointed out to her as the site of the castle, feeling very depressed, but at the same time with the lurking hope that the kind fairy would come once more to her aid. And so it turned out. The fairy appeared, promised to build the castle, and told Helena to lie down and go to sleep in the meantime. At the word of the fairy, the rocks and stones rose and built themselves into a beautiful castle, and before sunset it was all furnished inside, and left nothing to be desired. You may think how grateful Helena was when she awoke and found her task all finished, but her stepmother was anything but pleased, and went through the whole castle from top to bottom to see if she couldn't find some fault for which she could punish Helena. At last she went down into one of the cellars, but it was so dark that she fell down the steep stairs and was killed on the spot. So Helena was now mistress of the beautiful castle, and lived there in peace and happiness. And soon the noise of her beauty spread abroad, and many wooers came to try and gain her hand. Among them came one Prince Fickle by name, who very quickly won the love of fair Helena. One day, as they were sitting happily together under a lime tree in front of the castle, Prince Fickle broke the sad news to Helena that he must return to his parents to get their consent to his marriage. He promised faithfully to come back to her as soon as he could, and begged her to await his return under the lime tree, where they had spent so many happy hours. Helena kissed him tenderly at parting on his left cheek, and begged him not to let anyone else kiss him there while they were parted. And she promised to sit and wait for him under the lime tree, for she never doubted that the prince would be faithful to her and would return as quickly as he could. And so she sat for 3 days and 3 nights under the tree without moving. But when her lover never returned, she grew very unhappy and determined to set out to look for him. She took as many of her jewels as she could carry, and 3 of her most beautiful dresses, one embroidered with stars, one with moons, and the third with suns, all of pure gold. Far and wide she wandered through the world, but nowhere did she find any trace of her bridegroom. At last she gave up the search in despair. She could not bear to return to her own castle where she had been so happy with her lover, but determined rather to endure her loneliness and desolation in a strange land. She took a place as herd girl with a peasant, and buried her jewels and beautiful dresses in a safe and hidden spot. Every day she drove the cattle to pasture, and all the time she thought of nothing but her faithless bridegroom. She was very devoted to a certain little calf in the herd, and made a great pet of it, feeding it out of her own hands. She taught it to kneel before her, and then she whispered in its ear, "Kneel, little calf, kneel, be faithful and leal, not like Prince Fickle, who once on a time left his fair Helena under the lime." After some years passed in this way, she heard that the daughter of the king of the country she was living in was going to marry a prince called Fickle. Everybody rejoiced at the news, except poor Helena, to whom it was a fearful blow. For at the bottom of her heart, she had always believed her lover to be true. Now, it chanced that the way to the capital led right past the village where Helena was. And often, when she was leading her cattle forth to the meadows, Prince Fickle rode past her without ever noticing the poor herd girl. So engrossed was he in thoughts of his new bride. Then it occurred to Helena to put his heart to the test, and to see if it weren't possible to recall herself to him. So one day, as Prince Fickle rode by, she said to her little calf, "Kneel, little calf, kneel. Be faithful and leal, not like Prince Fickle, who once on a time left his poor Helena under the lime." When Prince Fickle heard her voice, it seemed to him to remind him of something, but of what he couldn't remember, for he hadn't heard the words distinctly, as Helena had only spoken them very low and with a shaky voice. Helena herself had been far too moved to let her see what impression her words had made on the prince. And when she looked round, he was already far away. But she noticed how slowly he was riding, and how deeply sunk he was in thought. So she didn't quite give herself up as lost. In honor of the approaching wedding, a feast lasting many nights was to be given in the capital. Helena placed all her hopes on this, and determined to go to the feast and there to seek out her bridegroom. When evening drew near, she stole out of the peasant's cottage secretly, and, going to her hiding place, she put on her dress embroidered with the gold suns and all her jewels, and loosed her beautiful golden hair, which up to now she had always worn under a kerchief, and, adorned thus, she set out for the town. When she entered the ballroom, all eyes were turned on her, and everyone marveled at her beauty. But no one knew who she was. Prince Fickle, too, was quite dazzled by the charms of the beautiful maiden, and never guessed that she had once been his own lady-love. He never left her side all night, and it was with great difficulty that Helena escaped from him in the crowd when it was time to return home. Prince Fickle searched for her everywhere and longed eagerly for the next night, when the beautiful lady had promised to come again. The following evening, the fair Helena started early for the feast. This time, she wore her dress embroidered with silver moons, and in her hair she placed a silver crescent. Prince Fickle was enchanted to see her again, and she seemed to him even more beautiful than she had been the night before. He never left her side and refused to dance with anyone else. He begged her to tell him who she was, but this she refused to do. Then he implored her to return again next evening, and this she promised him she would. On the third evening, Prince Fickle was so impatient to see his fair enchantress again that he arrived at the feast hours before it began, and never took his eyes from the door. At last, Helena arrived in a dress all covered with gold and silver stars, and with a girdle of stars round her waist, and a band of stars in her hair. Prince Fickle was more in love with her than ever, and begged her once again to tell him her name. Then Helena kissed him silently on the left cheek, and in one moment Prince Fickle recognized his old love. Full of remorse and sorrow, he begged for her forgiveness, and Helena, only too pleased to have got him back again, did not, you may be sure, keep him waiting very long for her pardon. And so they were married and returned to Helena's castle, where they are, no doubt, still sitting happily together under the lime tree. Puddocky. There was once upon a time a poor woman who had one little daughter called Parsley. She was so called because she liked eating parsley better than any other food. Indeed, she would hardly eat anything else. Her poor mother hadn't enough money always to be buying parsley for her, but the child was so beautiful that she could refuse her nothing. And so she went every night to the garden of an old witch who lived near and stole great branches of the coveted vegetable in order to satisfy her daughter. This remarkable taste of the fair parsley soon became known, and the theft was discovered. The witch called the girl's mother to her and proposed that she should let her daughter come and live with her, and then she could eat as much parsley as she liked. The mother was quite pleased with this suggestion, and so the beautiful parsley took up her abode with the old witch. One day, 3 princes, whom their father had sent abroad to travel, came to the town where Parsley lived and perceived the beautiful girl combing and plaiting her long black hair at the window. In one moment, they all fell hopelessly in love with her, and longed ardently to have the girl for their wife. But hardly had they with one breath expressed their desire, then, men with jealousy, they drew their swords, and all three set upon each other. The struggle was so violent, and the noise so loud, that the old witch heard it, and said at once, "Of course parsley is at the bottom of all this." And when she had convinced herself that this was so, she stepped forward, and full of wrath over the quarrels and feuds Parsley's beauty gave rise to, she cursed the girl and said, "I wish you were an ugly toad sitting under a bridge at the other end of the world." Hardly were the words out of her mouth than Parsley was changed into a toad and vanished from their sight. The princes, now that the cause of their dispute was removed, put up their swords, kissed each other affectionately, and returned to their father. The king was growing old and feeble, and wished to yield his scepter and crown in favor of one of his sons. But he couldn't make up his mind which of the three he should appoint as his successor. He determined that fate should decide for him. So he called his 3 children to him and said, "My dear sons, I am growing old and am weary of reigning, but I can't make up my mind to which of you 3 I should yield my crown, for I love you all equally. At the same time, I would like the best and cleverest of you to rule over my people. I have, therefore, determined to set you 3 tasks to do, and the one that performs them best shall be my heir. The first thing I shall ask you to do is to bring me a piece of linen 100 yards long, so fine that it will go through a gold ring." The sons bowed low, and, promising to do their best, they started on their journey without further delay. The 2 elder brothers took many servants and carriages with them, but the youngest set out quite alone. In a short time, they came to 3 crossroads. 2 of them were gay and crowded, but the third was dark and lonely. The 2 elder brothers chose the more frequented ways, but the youngest, bidding them farewell, set out on the dreary road. Wherever linen was to be bought, there the 2 elder brothers hastened. They loaded their carriages with bales of the finest linen they could find, and then returned home. The youngest brother, on the other hand, went on his weary way for many days, and nowhere did he come across any linen that would have done. So he journeyed on, and his spirits sank with every step. At last he came to a bridge which stretched over a deep river, flowing through a flat and marshy land. Before crossing the bridge, he sat down on the banks of the stream and sighed dismally over his sad fate. Suddenly, a misshapen toad crawled out of the swamp, and sitting down opposite him, asked, "What's the matter with you, my dear prince?" The prince answered impatiently, "There's not much good my telling you, Puddocky, for you couldn't help me if I did." "Don't be too sure of that," replied the toad. "Tell me your trouble, and we'll see." Then the prince became most confidential and told the little creature why he had been sent out of his father's kingdom. "Prince, I will certainly help you," said the toad. And crawling back into her swamp, she returned, dragging after her a piece of linen not bigger than a finger, which she lay before the prince, saying, "Take this home, and you'll see it will help you." The prince had no wish to take such an insignificant bundle with him, but he didn't like to hurt Puddocky's feelings by refusing it. So he took up the little packet, put it in his pocket, and bade the little toad farewell. Puddocky watched the prince till he was out of sight, and then crept back into the water. The further the prince went, the more he noticed that the pocket in which the little roll of linen lay became heavier, and in proportion his heart grew lighter. And so, greatly comforted, he returned to the court of his father, and arrived home just at the same time as his brothers with their caravans. The king was delighted to see them all again, and at once drew the ring from his finger, and the trial began. In all the wagon loads, there was not one piece of linen, the 10th part of which would go through the ring. And the two elder brothers, who had at first sneered at their youngest brother for returning with no baggage, began to feel rather small. But what were their feelings when he drew a bale of linen out of his pocket, which in fineness, softness, and purity of color was unsurpassable? The threads were hardly visible, and it went through the ring without the smallest difficulty, at the same time measuring 100 yards quite correctly. The father embraced his fortunate son, and commanded the rest of the linen to be thrown into the water. Then, turning to his children, he said, "Now, dear princes, prepare yourselves for the second task. You must bring me back a little dog that will go comfortably into a walnut shell." The sons were all in despair over this demand, but as they each wished to win the crown, they determined to do their best, and after a very few days set out on their travels again. At the crossroads, they separated once more. The youngest went by himself along his lonely way, but this time he felt much more cheerful. Hardly had he sat down under the bridge and heaved a sigh, then Puddocky came out, and sitting down opposite him, asked, "What's wrong with you now, dear prince?" The prince, who this time never doubted the little toad's power to help him, told her his difficulty at once. "Prince, I will help you," said the toad again, and crawled back into her swamp as fast as her short little legs would carry her. She returned, dragging a hazel nut behind her, which she laid at the prince's feet, and said, "Take this nut home with you, and tell your father to crack it very carefully, and you'll see then what will happen." The prince thanked her heartily and went on his way in the best of spirits, while the little puddock crept slowly back into the water. When the prince got home, he found his brothers had just arrived with great wagon loads of little dogs of all sorts. The king had a walnut shell ready, and the trial began. But not one of the dogs the two eldest sons had brought with them would in the least fit into the shell. When they had tried all their little dogs, the youngest son handed his father the hazelnut with a modest bow and begged him to crack it carefully. Hardly had the old king done so than a lovely tiny dog sprang out of the nutshell and ran about on the king's hand, wagging its tail and barking lustily at all the other little dogs. The joy of the court was great. The father again embraced his fortunate son, commanded the rest of the small dogs to be thrown into the water and drowned, and once more addressed his sons. The two most difficult tasks have been performed. Now listen to the third and last. Whoever brings the fairest wife home with him shall be my heir. This demand seemed so easy and agreeable, and the reward was so great that the princes lost no time in setting forth on their travels. At the crossroads, the two elder brothers debated if they should go the same way as the youngest. But when they saw how dreary and deserted it looked, they made up their minds that it would be impossible to find what they sought in these wilds, and so they stuck to their former paths. The youngest was very depressed this time, and said to himself, "Anything else Puddocky could have helped me in, but this task is quite beyond her power. How could she ever find a beautiful wife for me? Her swamps are wide and empty, and no human beings dwell there, only frogs and toads and other creatures of that sort." However, he sat down as usual under the bridge, and this time he sighed from the bottom of his heart. In a few minutes, the toad stood in front of him and asked, "What's the matter with you now, my dear prince?" "Oh, Puddocky, this time you can't help me, for the task is beyond even your power," replied the prince. "Still," answered the toad, "you may as well tell me your difficulty, for who knows but I mayn't be able to help you this time also." The prince then told her the task they had been set to do. "I'll help you right enough, my dear prince," said the little toad. "Just you go home, and I'll soon follow you." With these words, Puddocky, with a spring quite unlike her usual slow movements, jumped into the water and disappeared. The prince rose up and went sadly on his way, for he didn't believe it possible that the little toad could really help him in his present difficulty. He had hardly gone a few steps when he heard a sound behind him, and looking round, he saw a carriage made of cardboard, drawn by 6 big rats, coming towards him. 2 hedgehogs rode in front as outriders, and on the box sat a fat mouse as coachman, and behind stood 2 little frogs as footmen. In the carriage itself sat Puddocky, who kissed her hand to the prince out of the window as she passed by. Sunk deep in thought over the fickleness of fortune that had granted him 2 of his wishes, and now seemed about to deny him the last and best, the prince hardly noticed the absurd equipage, and still less did he feel inclined to laugh at its comic appearance. The carriage drove on in front of him for some time, and then turned a corner. But what was his joy and surprise when suddenly, round the same corner, but coming towards him, there appeared a beautiful coach drawn by 6 splendid horses, with outriders, coachmen, footmen, and other servants, all in the most gorgeous liveries. And seated in the carriage was the most beautiful woman the prince had ever seen, and in whom he at once recognized the beautiful Parsley, for whom his heart had formerly burned. The carriage stopped when it reached him, and the footman sprang down and opened the door for him. He got in and sat down beside the beautiful Parsley, and thanked her heartily for her help, and told her how much he loved her. And so he arrived at his father's capital, at the same moment as his brothers, who had returned with many carriage loads of beautiful women. But when they were all led before the king, the whole court, with one consent, awarded the prize of beauty to the fair Parsley. The old king was delighted, and embraced his thrice fortunate son and his new daughter-in-law tenderly, and appointed them as his successors to the throne. But he commanded the other women to be thrown into the water and drowned, like the bales of linen and the little dogs. The prince married Puddocky, and reigned long and happily with her. And if they aren't dead, I suppose they are living still. The story of Hok Lee and the Dwarfs. There once lived in a small town in China a man named Hok Lee. He was a steady, industrious man who not only worked hard at his trade, but did all his own housework as well, for he had no wife to do it for him. What an excellent, industrious man is this Hok Lee, said his neighbors. How hard he works. He never leaves his house to amuse himself or to take a holiday, as others do. But Hok Lee was by no means the virtuous person his neighbors thought him. True, he worked hard enough by day, but at night, when all respectable folk were fast asleep, he used to steal out and join a dangerous band of robbers, who broke into rich people's houses and carried off all they could lay hands on. This state of things went on for some time, and though a thief was caught now and then and punished, no suspicion ever fell on Hok Lee. He was such a very respectable, hard-working man. Hok Lee had already amassed a good store of money as his share of the proceeds of these robberies, when it happened one morning on going to market that a neighbor said to him, "Why, Hok Lee, what is the matter with your face? One side of it is all swelled up." True enough, Hok Lee's right cheek was twice the size of his left, and it soon began to feel very uncomfortable. "I will bind up my face," said Hok Lee. "Doubtless the warmth will cure the swelling." But no such thing. Next day it was worse, and day by day it grew bigger and bigger, till it was nearly as large as his head, and became very painful. Hok Lee was at his wits' ends what to do. Not only was his cheek unsightly and painful, but his neighbors began to jeer and make fun of him, which hurt his feelings very much indeed. One day, as luck would have it, a traveling doctor came to the town. He sold not only all kinds of medicine, but also dealt in many strange charms against witches and evil spirits. Hok Lee determined to consult him and asked him into his house. After the doctor had examined him carefully, he spoke thus: "This, O Hok Lee, is no ordinary swelled face. I strongly suspect you have been doing some wrong deed, which has called down the anger of the spirits on you. None of my drugs will avail to cure you. But if you are willing to pay me handsomely, I can tell you how you may be cured." Then Hok Lee and the doctor began to bargain together, and it was a long time before they could come to terms. However, the doctor got the better of it in the end, for he was determined not to part with his secret under a certain price, and Hok Lee had no mind to carry his huge cheek about with him to the end of his days. So he was obliged to part with the greater portion of his ill-gotten gains. When the doctor had pocketed the money, he told Hok Lee to go on the first night of the full moon to a certain wood, and there to watch by a particular tree. After a time, he would see the dwarfs and little sprites who live underground come out to dance. When they saw him, they would be sure to make him dance too. "And mind you, dance your very best," added the doctor. "If you dance well and please them, they will grant you a petition, and you can then beg to be cured. But if you dance badly, they will most likely do you some mischief out of spite." With that, he took leave and departed. Happily, the first night of the full moon was near, and at the proper time Hok Lee set out for the wood. With a little trouble, he found the tree the doctor had described, and, feeling nervous, he climbed up into it. He had hardly settled himself on a branch when he saw the little dwarfs assembling in the moonlight. They came from all sides, till at length there appeared to be hundreds of them. They seemed in high glee, and danced and skipped and capered about, whilst Hok Lee grew so eager watching them that he crept further and further along his branch, till at length it gave a loud crack. All the dwarfs stood still, and Hok Lee felt as if his heart stood still also. Then one of the dwarfs called out, "Someone is up in that tree. Come down at once, whoever you are, or we must come and fetch you." In great terror, Hok Lee proceeded to come down, but he was so nervous that he tripped near the ground and came rolling down in the most absurd manner. When he had picked himself up, he came forward with a low bow, and the dwarf who had first spoken and who appeared to be the leader said, "Now then, who art thou, and what brings thee here?" So Hok Lee told him the sad story of his swelled cheek, and how he had been advised to come to the forest and beg the dwarfs to cure him. "It is well," replied the dwarf. "We will see about that. First, however, thou must dance before us. Should thy dancing please us, perhaps we may be able to do something. But shouldst thou dance badly, we shall assuredly punish thee. So now take warning, and dance away." With that, he and all the other dwarfs sat down in a large ring, leaving Hok Lee to dance alone in the middle. He felt half frightened to death, and besides, was a good deal shaken by his fall from the tree, and did not feel at all inclined to dance. But the dwarfs were not to be trifled with. "Begin!" cried their leader, and "Begin!" shouted the rest in chorus. So, in despair, Hok Lee began. First, he hopped on one foot, and then on the other. But he was so stiff and so nervous that he made but a poor attempt, and after a time sank down on the ground and vowed he could dance no more. The dwarfs were very angry. They crowded round Hok Lee and abused him. "Thou to come here to be cured, indeed," they cried. "Thou hast brought one big cheek with thee, but thou shalt take away two." And with that, they ran off and disappeared, leaving Hok Lee to find his way home as best he might. He hobbled away, weary and depressed, and not a little anxious on account of the dwarf's threat. Nor were his fears unfounded, for when he rose next morning, his left cheek was swelled up as big as his right, and he could hardly see out of his eyes. Hok Lee felt in despair, and his neighbors jeered at him more than ever. The doctor, too, had disappeared, so there was nothing for it but to try the dwarfs once more. He waited a month till the first night of the full moon came round again, and then he trudged back to the forest and sat down under the tree from which he had fallen. He had not long to wait. Ere long, the dwarfs came trooping out till all were assembled. "I don't feel quite easy," said one. "I feel as if some horrid human being were near us." When Hok Lee heard this, he came forward and bent down to the ground before the dwarfs. who came crowding round, and laughed heartily at his comical appearance with his 2 big cheeks. "What dost thou want?" they asked. And Hok Lee proceeded to tell them of his fresh misfortunes, and begged so hard to be allowed one more trial at dancing that the dwarfs consented, for there is nothing they love so much as being amused. Now, Hok Lee knew how much depended on his dancing well, so he plucked up a good spirit and began, first quite slowly and faster by degrees, and he danced so well and gracefully and made such new and wonderful steps that the dwarfs were quite delighted with him. They clapped their tiny hands and shouted, "Well done, Hok Lee! Well done! Go on, dance more, for we are pleased." And Hok Lee danced on and on, till he really could dance no more, and was obliged to stop. Then the leader of the dwarfs said, "We are well pleased, Hok Lee, and as a recompense for thy dancing, thy face shall be cured. Farewell." With these words, he and the other dwarfs vanished, and Hok Lee, putting his hands to his face, found to his great joy that his cheeks were reduced to their natural size. The way home seemed short and easy to him, and he went to bed happy, and resolved never to go out robbing again. Next day, the whole town was full of the news of Hok's sudden cure. His neighbors questioned him, but could get nothing from him, except the fact that he had discovered a wonderful cure for all kinds of diseases. After a time, a rich neighbor, who had been ill for some years, came and offered to give Hok Lee a large sum of money if he would tell him how he might get cured. Hok Lee consented on condition that he swore to keep the secret. He did so, and Hok Lee told him of the dwarfs and their dances. The neighbor went off, carefully obeyed Hok Lee's directions, and was duly cured by the dwarfs. Then another and another came to Hok Lee to beg his secret, and from each he extracted a vow of secrecy and a large sum of money. This went on for some years, so that at length Hok Lee became a very wealthy man and ended his days in peace and prosperity. The story of the 3 bears. Once upon a time, there were 3 bears who lived together in a house of their own in a wood. One of them was a little, small, wee bear, and one was a middle-sized bear, and the other was a great, huge bear. They had each a pot for their porridge, a little pot for the little, small, wee bear, and a middle-sized pot for the middle bear, and a great pot for the great, huge bear. And they had each a chair to sit in, a little chair for the little, small, wee bear, and a middle-sized chair for the middle bear, and a great chair for the great, huge bear. And they had each a bed to sleep in, a little bed for the little, small, wee bear, and a middle-sized bed for the middle bear, and a great bed for the great, huge bear. One day, after they had made the porridge for their breakfast and poured it into their porridge pots, they walked out into the wood while the porridge was cooling, that they might not burn their mouths by beginning too soon to eat it. And while they were walking, a little old woman came to the house. She could not have been a good, honest old woman. For first, she looked in at the window, and then she peeped in at the keyhole, and seeing nobody in the house, she lifted the latch. The door was not fastened, because the bears were good bears, who did nobody any harm, and never suspected that anybody would harm them. So the little old woman opened the door and went in, and well pleased she was when she saw the porridge on the table. If she had been a good little old woman, she would have waited till the bears came home, and then, perhaps, they would have asked her to breakfast, for they were good bears, a little rough or so, as the manner of bears is, but for all that very good-natured and hospitable. But she was an impudent but old woman, and set about helping herself. So first she tasted the porridge of the great, huge bear, and that was too hot for her, and she said a bad word about that. And then she tasted the porridge of the middle bear, and that was too cold for her, and she said a bad word about that too. And then she went to the porridge of the little, small, wee bear, and tasted that, and that was neither too hot nor too cold, but just right, and she liked it so well that she ate it all up. But the naughty old woman said a bad word about the little porridge pot, because it did not hold enough for her. Then the little old woman sat down in the chair of the great, huge bear, and that was too hard for her. And then she sat down in the chair of the middle bear, and that was too soft for her. And then she sat down in the chair of the little, small, wee bear, and that was neither too hard nor too soft, but just right. So she seated herself in it, and there she sat till the bottom of the chair came out, and down came she, plump upon the ground. And the naughty old woman said a wicked word about that too. Then the little old woman went upstairs into the bedchamber in which the three bears slept. And first she lay down upon the bed of the great, huge bear, but that was too high at the head for her. And next she lay down upon the bed of the middle bear, and that was too high at the foot for her. And then she lay down upon the bed of the little, small, wee bear, and that was neither too high at the head nor at the foot, but just right. So she covered herself up comfortably, and lay there till she fell fast asleep. By this time, the three bears thought their porridge would be cool enough, so they came home to breakfast. Now the little old woman had left the spoon of the great, huge bear standing in his porridge, "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the great, huge bear in his great, gruff voice. And when the middle bear looked at his, he saw that the spoon was standing in it too. They were wooden spoons. If they had been silver ones, the naughty old woman would have put them in her pocket. "Somebody has been at my porridge," said the middle bear in his middle voice. Then the little, small, wee bear looked at his, and there was the spoon in the porridge pot, but the porridge was all gone. "Somebody has been at my porridge and has eaten it all up," said the little, small, wee bear in his little, small, wee voice. Upon this, the three bears, seeing that someone had entered their house and eaten up the little, small, wee bear's breakfast, began to look about them. Now the little old woman had not put the hard cushion straight when she rose from the chair of the great, huge bear. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the great, huge bear in his great, rough, gruff voice. And the little old woman had squatted down the soft cushion of the middle bear. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair," said the middle bear in his middle voice. And you know what the little old woman had done to the third chair. "Somebody has been sitting in my chair and has sat the bottom of it out," said the little, small, wee bear in his little, small, wee voice. Then the three bears thought it necessary that they should make farther search. So they went upstairs into their bedchamber. Now the little old woman had pulled the pillow of the great, huge bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the great, huge bear in his great, rough, gruff voice. And the little old woman had pulled the bolster of the middle bear out of its place. "Somebody has been lying in my bed," said the middle bear in his middle voice. And when the little, small, wee bear came to look at his bed, there was the bolster in its place, and the pillow in its place upon the bolster. And upon the pillow was the little old woman's ugly, dirty head, which was not in its place, for she had no business there. "Somebody has been lying in my bed, and here she is," said the little, small, wee bear in his little, small, wee voice. The little old woman had heard in her sleep the great, rough, gruff voice of the great, huge bear. But she was so fast asleep that it was no more to her than the roaring of wind or the rumbling of thunder. And she had heard the middle voice of the middle bear, but it was only as if she had heard someone speaking in a dream. But when she heard the little, small, wee voice of the little, small, wee bear, it was so sharp and so shrill that it awakened her at once. Up she started, and when she saw the three bears on one side of the bed, she tumbled herself out at the other and ran to the window. Now the window was open, because the bears, like good, tidy bears as they were, always opened their bedchamber window when they got up in the morning. Out the little old woman jumped, and whether she broke her neck in the fall, or ran into the wood and was lost there, or found her way out of the wood and was taken up by the constable and sent to the house of correction for a vagrant as she was, I cannot tell. But the 3 bears never saw anything more of her. Prince Vivien and the Princess Placida. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen who loved one another dearly. Indeed, the queen, whose name was Santorina, was so pretty and so kind-hearted that it would have been a wonder if her husband had not been fond of her, while King Gridolin himself was a perfect bundle of good qualities. For the fairy, who presided at his christening, had summoned the shades of all his ancestors and taken something good from each of them to form his character. Unfortunately, though, she had given him rather too much kindness of heart, which is a thing that generally gets its possessor into trouble. But so far, all things had prospered with King Gridolin. However, it was not to be expected such good fortune could last. And before very long, the queen had a lovely little daughter, who was named Placida. Now the king, who thought that if she resembled her mother in face and mind, she would need no other gift, never troubled to ask any of the fairies to her christening. And this offended them mortally, so that they resolved to punish him severely for thus depriving them of their rights. So, to the despair of King Gridolin, the queen first of all became very ill, and then disappeared altogether. If it had not been for the little princess, there is no saying what would have become of him. He was so miserable. But there she was to be brought up. And luckily, the good fairy Lolotte, in spite of all that had passed, was willing to come and take charge of her, and of her little cousin, Prince Vivien, who was an orphan and had been placed under the care of his uncle, King Gridolin, when he was quite a baby, although she neglected nothing that could possibly have been done for them. Their characters, as they grew up, plainly proved that education only softens down natural defects, but cannot entirely do away with them. For Placida, who was perfectly lovely, and with a capacity and intelligence which enabled her to learn and understand anything that presented itself, was at the same time as lazy and indifferent as it is possible for anyone to be, while Vivien, on the contrary, was only too lively, and was forever taking up some new thing, and as promptly tiring of it, and flying off to something else, which held his fickle fancy an equally short time. As these 2 children would possibly inherit the kingdom, it was natural that their people should take a great interest in them, and it fell out that all the tranquil, and peace-loving citizens desired that Placida should one day be their queen, while the rash and quarrelsome hoped great things for Vivien. Such a division of ideas seemed to promise civil wars and all kinds of troubles to the state. And even in the palace, the two parties frequently came into collision. As for the children themselves, though they were too well brought up to quarrel, still the difference in all their tastes and feelings made it impossible for them to like one another. So there seemed no chance of their ever consenting to be married, which was a pity, since that was the only thing that would have satisfied both parties. Prince Vivien was fully aware of the feeling in his favor, but being too honorable to wish to injure his pretty cousin, and perhaps too impatient and volatile to care to think seriously about anything, he suddenly took it into his head that he would go off by himself in search of adventure. Luckily, this idea occurred to him when he was on horseback, for he would certainly have set out on foot rather than lose an instant. As it was, he simply turned his horse's head, without another thought than that of getting out of the kingdom as soon as possible. This abrupt departure was a great blow to the state, especially as no one had any idea what had become of the prince. Even King Gridolin, who had never cared for anything since the disappearance of Queen Santorina, was roused by this new loss. And though he could not so much as look at the Princess Placida without shedding floods of tears, he resolved to see for himself what talents and capabilities she showed. He very soon found out that in addition to her natural indolence, she was being as much indulged and spoilt day by day as if the fairy had been her grandmother, and was obliged to remonstrate very seriously upon the subject. Lolotte took his reproaches meekly and promised faithfully that she would not encourage the princess in her idleness and indifference any more. From this moment, poor Placida's troubles began. She was actually expected to choose her own dresses, to take care of her jewels, and to find her own amusements. But rather than take so much trouble, she wore the same old frock from morning till night, and never appeared in public if she could possibly avoid it. However, this was not all. King Gridolin insisted that the affairs of the kingdom should be explained to her, and that she should attend all the councils and give her opinion upon the matter in hand whenever it was asked of her. And this made her life such a burden to her that she implored Lolotte to take her away from a country where too much was required of an unhappy princess. The fairy refused at first with a great show of firmness, but who could resist the tears and entreaties of anyone so pretty as Placida? It came to this in the end, that she transported the princess just as she was, cozily tucked up upon her favorite couch, to her own grotto. And this new disappearance left all the people in despair, and Gridolin went about looking more distracted than ever. But now, let us return to Prince Vivien and see what his restless spirit has brought him to. Though Placida's kingdom was a large one, his horse had carried him gallantly to the limit of it, but it could go no further, and the prince was obliged to dismount and continue his journey on foot, though this slow mode of progress tired his patience severely. After what seemed to him a very long time, he found himself all alone in a vast forest, so dark and gloomy that he secretly shuddered. However, he chose the most promising-looking path he could find and marched along it courageously at his best speed. But in spite of all his efforts, night fell before he reached the edge of the wood. For some time, he stumbled along, keeping to the path as well as he could in the darkness, and just as he was almost wearied out, he saw before him a gleam of light. This sight revived his drooping spirits, and he made sure that he was now close to the shelter and supper he needed so much. But the more he walked towards the light, the further away it seemed. Sometimes he even lost sight of it altogether, and you may imagine how provoked and impatient he was by the time he finally arrived at the miserable cottage from which the light proceeded. He gave a loud knock at the door, and an old woman's voice answered from within. But as she did not seem to be hurrying herself to open it, he redoubled his blows and demanded to be let in imperiously, quite forgetting that he was no longer in his own kingdom. But all this had no effect upon the old woman, who only noticed all the uproar he was making by saying gently, "You must have patience." He could hear that she really was coming to open the door to him, only she was so very long about it. First, she chased away her cat, lest it should run away when the door was opened. Then he heard her talking to herself and made out that her lamp wanted trimming, that she might see better who it was that knocked, and then that it lacked fresh oil, and she must refill it. So, what with one thing and another, she was an immense time trotting to and fro, and all the while she now and again bade the prince have patience. When at last he stood within the little hut, he saw with despair that it was a picture of poverty, and that not a crumb of anything eatable was to be seen. And when he explained to the old woman that he was dying of hunger and fatigue, she only answered tranquilly that he must have patience. However, she presently showed him a bundle of straw on which he could sleep. "But what can I have to eat?" cried Prince Vivien sharply. "Wait a little, she replied. "If you will only have patience, I am just going out into the garden to gather some peas. We will shell them at our leisure. Then I will light a fire and cook them, and when they are thoroughly done, we can enjoy them peaceably. There is no hurry. I shall have died of starvation by the time all that is done," said the prince ruefully. Patience, patience," said the old woman, looking at him with her slow, gentle smile. "I can't be hurried. All things come at last to him who waits." You must have heard that often. Prince Vivien was wild with aggravation, but there was nothing to be done. "Come then," said the old woman. "You shall hold the lamp to light me while I pick the peas." The prince, in his haste, snatched it up so quickly that it went out, and it took him a long time to light it again with 2 little bits of glowing charcoal, which he had to dig out from the pile of ashes upon the hearth. However, at last the peas were gathered and shelled, and the fire lighted. But then they had to be carefully counted, since the old woman declared that she would cook 54, and no more. In vain did the prince represent to her that he was famished, that 54 peas would go no way towards satisfying his hunger, that a few peas, more or less, surely could not matter. It was quite useless. In the end, he had to count out the 54, and worse than that, because he dropped 1 or 2 in his hurry, he had to begin again from the very first to be sure the number was complete as soon as they were cooked. The old dame took a pair of scales and a morsel of bread from the cupboard, and was just about to divide it when Prince Vivien, who really could wait no longer, seized the whole piece and ate it up, saying in his turn, "Patience." "You mean that for a joke," said the old woman, as gently as ever. "But that is really my name, and some day you will know more about me." Then they each ate their 27 peas, and the prince was surprised to find that he wanted nothing more, and he slept as sweetly upon his bed of straw as he had ever done in his palace. In the morning, the old woman gave him milk and bread for his breakfast, which he ate contentedly, rejoicing that there was nothing to be gathered or counted or cooked. And when he had finished, he begged her to tell him who she was. "That I will, with pleasure," she replied. "But it will be a long story." "Oh, if it's long, I can't listen," cried the prince. "But," said she, "at your age, you should attend to what old people say and learn to have patience." But, said the prince, in his most impatient tone, "old people should not be so long-winded. Tell me what country I have got into, and nothing else." "With all my heart," said she. "You are in the forest of the blackbird. It is here that he utters his oracles." "An oracle," cried the prince. "Oh, I must go and consult him." Thereupon he drew a handful of gold from his pocket and offered it to the old woman. And when she would not take it, he threw it down upon the table and was off like a flash of lightning, without even staying to ask the way. He took the first path that presented itself and followed it at the top of his speed, often losing his way or stumbling over some stone, or running up against a tree, and leaving behind him, without regret, the cottage which had been as little to his taste as the character of its possessor. After some time, he saw in the distance a huge black castle which commanded a view of the whole forest. The prince felt certain that this must be the abode of the oracle, and just as the sun was setting, he reached its outermost gates. The whole castle was surrounded by a deep moat, and the drawbridge, and the gates, and even the water in the moat were all of the same somber hue as the walls and towers. Upon the gate hung a huge bell, upon which was written in red letters, "Mortal, if thou art curious to know thy fate, strike this bell, and submit to what shall befall thee." The prince, without the smallest hesitation, snatched up a great stone and hammered vigorously upon the bell, which gave forth a deep and terrible sound. The gate flew open and closed again with a thundering clang the moment the prince had passed through it, while from every tower and battlement rose a wheeling, screaming crowd of bats which darkened the whole sky with their multitudes. Anyone but Prince Vivien would have been terrified by such an uncanny sight. But he strode stoutly forward till he reached the second gate, which was opened to him by 60 black slaves covered from head to foot in long mantles. He wished to speak to them, but soon discovered that they spoke an utterly unknown language and did not seem to understand a word he said. This was a great aggravation to the prince, who was not accustomed to keep his ideas to himself, and he positively found himself wishing for his old friend, Patience. However, he had to follow his guides in silence, and they led him into a magnificent hall. The floor was of ebony, the walls of jet, and all the hangings were of black velvet. But the prince looked round it in vain for something to eat, and then made signs that he was hungry. In the same manner, he was respectfully given to understand that he must wait. And after several hours, the 60 hooded and shrouded figures reappeared and conducted him with great ceremony, and also very, very slowly, to a banqueting hall, where they all placed themselves at a long table. The dishes were arranged down the center of it, and with his usual impetuosity, the prince seized the one that stood in front of him to draw it nearer, but soon found that it was firmly fixed in its place. Then he looked at his solemn and lugubrious neighbors, and saw that each one was supplied with a long hollow reed, through which he slowly sucked up his portion. And the prince was obliged to do the same, though he found it a frightfully tedious process. After supper, they returned as they had come to the ebony room, where he was compelled to look on while his companions played interminable games of chess, and not until he was nearly dying of weariness did they, slowly and ceremoniously as before, conduct him to his sleeping apartment. The hope of consulting the oracle woke him very early the next morning, and his first demand was to be allowed to present himself before it. But, without replying, his attendants conducted him to a huge marble bath, very shallow at one end, and quite deep at the other, and gave him to understand that he was to go into it. The prince, nothing loath, was for springing at once into deep water. But he was gently but forcibly held back, and only allowed to stand where it was about an inch deep. And he was nearly wild with impatience when he found that this process was to be repeated every day, in spite of all he could say or do, the water rising higher and higher by inches, so that for 60 days he had to live in perpetual silence, ceremoniously conducted to and fro, supping all his meals through the long reed, and looking on at innumerable games of chess, the game of all others which he detested most. But at last the water rose as high as his chin, and his bath was complete. And that day the slaves in their black robes, and each having a large bat perched upon his head, marched in slow procession with the prince in their midst, chanting a melancholy song, to the iron gate that led into a kind of temple. At the sound of their chanting, another band of slaves appeared, and took possession of the unhappy Vivien. They looked to him exactly like the ones he had left, except that they moved more slowly still, and each one held a raven upon his wrist, and their harsh croakings re-echoed through the dismal place. Holding the prince by the arms, not so much to do him honor as to restrain his impatience, they proceeded by slow degrees up the steps of the temple. And when they at last reached the top, he thought his long waiting must be at an end. But on the contrary, after slowly enshrouding him in a long black robe like their own, they led him into the temple itself, where he was forced to witness numbers of lengthy rites and ceremonies. By this time, Vivien's active impatience had subsided into passive weariness. His yawns were continual and scandalous, but nobody heeded him. He stared hopelessly at the thick black curtain which hung down straight in front of him, and could hardly believe his eyes when it presently began to slide back, and he saw before him the black bird. It was of enormous size, and was perched upon a thick bar of iron which ran across from one side of the temple to the other. At the sight of it all, the slaves fell upon their knees and hid their faces, and when it had 3 times flapped its mighty wings, it uttered distinctly in Prince Vivien's own language the words, "Prince, your only chance of happiness depends upon that which is most opposed to your own nature. Then the curtain fell before it once more, and the prince, after many ceremonies, was presented with a raven which perched upon his wrist, and was conducted slowly back to the iron gate. Here the raven left him, and he was handed over once more to the care of the first band of slaves, while a large bat flickered down and settled upon his head of its own accord. And so he was taken back to the marble bath and had to go through the whole process again. Only this time he began in deep water, which receded daily, inch by inch. When this was over, the slaves escorted him to the outer gate and took leave of him with every mark of esteem and politeness, to which it is to be feared he responded but indifferently, since the gate was no sooner opened than he took to his heels and fled away with all his might, his one idea being to put as much space as possible between himself and the dreary place into which he had ventured so rashly, just to consult a tedious oracle who, after all, had told him nothing. He actually reflected for about 5 seconds on his folly, and came to the conclusion that it might sometimes be advisable to think before one acted. After wandering about for several days until he was weary and hungry, he at last succeeded in finding a way out of the forest, and soon came to a wide and rapid river, which he followed, hoping to find some means of crossing it. And it happened that as the sun rose the next morning, he saw something of a dazzling whiteness moored out in the middle of the stream. Upon looking more attentively at it, he found that it was one of the prettiest little ships he had ever seen, and the boat that belonged to it was made fast to the bank quite close to him. The prince was immediately seized with the most ardent desire to go on board the ship, and shouted loudly to attract the notice of her crew. But no one answered. So he sprang into the little boat and rowed away, without finding it at all hard work. For the boat was made all of white paper, and was as light as a rose leaf. The ship was made of white paper too, as the prince presently discovered when he reached it. He found not a soul on board, but there was a very cozy little bed in the cabin, and an ample supply of all sorts of good things to eat and drink, which he made up his mind to enjoy until something new happened, having been thoroughly well brought up at the court of King Gridolin. Of course, he understood the art of navigation, but when once he had started, the current carried the vessel down at such a pace that before he knew where he was, the prince found himself out at sea, and a wind springing up behind him just at this moment soon drove him out of sight of land. By this time, he was somewhat alarmed, and did his best to put the ship about and get back to the river. But wind and tide were too strong for him, and he began to think of the number of times from his childhood up that he had been warned not to meddle with water. But it was too late now to do anything but wish vainly that he had stayed on shore, and to grow heartily weary of the boat and the sea and everything connected with it. These two things, however, he did most thoroughly. To put the finishing touch to his misfortunes, he presently found himself becalmed in mid-ocean, a state of affairs which would be considered trying by the most patient of men. So you may imagine how it affected Prince Vivien. He even came to wishing himself back at the castle of the Black Bird, for there at least he saw some living beings, whereas on board the white paper ship he was absolutely alone, and could not imagine how he was ever to get away from his wearisome prison. However, after a very long time, he did see land, and his impatience to be on shore was so great that he at once flung himself over the ship's side that he might reach it sooner by swimming. But this was quite useless, for spring as far as he might from the vessel, it was always under his feet again before he reached the water, and he had to resign himself to his fate and wait with what patience he could muster until the winds and waves carried the ship into a kind of natural harbor which ran far into the land. After his long imprisonment at sea, the prince was delighted with the sight of the great trees which grew down to the very edge of the water, and leaping lightly on shore, he speedily lost himself in the thick forest. When he had wandered a long way, he stopped to rest beside a clear spring of water. But scarcely had he thrown himself down upon the mossy bank when there was a great rustling in the bushes close by, and out sprang a pretty little gazelle, panting and exhausted, which fell at his feet, gasping out, "Oh, Vivien, save me." The prince, in great astonishment, leapt to his feet, and had just time to draw his sword before he found himself face to face with a large green lion, which had been hotly pursuing the poor little gazelle. Prince Vivien attacked it gallantly, and a fierce combat ensued, which, however, ended before long in the prince's dealing his adversary a terrific blow, which felled him to the earth. As he fell, the lion whistled loudly 3 times, with such force that the forest rang again, and the sound must have been heard for more than 2 leagues round. After which, having apparently nothing more to do in the world, he rolled over on his side and died. The prince, without paying any further heed to him or to his whistling, returned to the pretty gazelle, saying, "Well, are you satisfied now? Since you can talk, pray tell me instantly what all this is about, and how you happen to know my name." "Oh, I must rest for a long time before I can talk," she replied. "And beside, I very much doubt if you will have leisure to listen, for the affair is by no means finished, In fact, she continued in the same languid tone, you had better look behind you now. The prince turned sharply round, and to his horror saw a huge giant approaching with mighty strides, crying fiercely, "Who has made my lion whistle? I should like to know." "I have," replied Prince Vivien boldly, "but I can answer for it that he will not do it again." At these words, the giant began to howl and lament. "Alas, my poor Tiny, my sweet little pet," he cried, "but at least I can avenge thy death." Thereupon he rushed at the prince, brandishing an immense serpent which was coiled about his wrist. Vivien, without losing his coolness, aimed a terrific blow at it with his sword. But no sooner did he touch the snake than it changed into a giant, and the giant into a snake, with such rapidity that the prince felt perfectly giddy. And this happened at least half a dozen times, until at last, with a fortunate stroke, he cut the serpent in halves, and picking up one morsel, flung it with all his force at the nose of the giant, who fell insensible on top of the lion. And in an instant, a thick black cloud rolled up, which hid them from view. And when it cleared away, they had all disappeared. Then the prince, without even waiting to sheathe his sword, rushed back to the gazelle, crying, "Now you have had plenty of time to recover your wits, and you have nothing more to fear. So tell me who you are, and what this horrible giant, with his lion and his serpent, have to do with you, and for pity's sake, be quick about it." "I will tell you with pleasure," she answered, "but where is the hurry? I want you to come back with me to the Green Castle, but I don't want to walk there. It is so far, and walking is so fatiguing." "Let us set out at once, then," replied the prince severely, "or else really I shall have to leave you where you are. Surely a young and active gazelle like you ought to be ashamed of not being able to walk a few steps. The further off this castle is, the faster we ought to walk. But as you don't appear to enjoy that, I will promise that we will go gently, and we can talk by the way. It would be better still if you would carry me," said she sweetly. "But as I don't like to see people giving themselves trouble, you may carry me, and make that snail carry you." So saying, she pointed languidly with one tiny foot at what the prince had taken for a block of stone, but now he saw that it was a huge snail. "What? I ride a snail?" cried the prince. "You are laughing at me, and beside, we should not get there for a year." "Oh, well then, don't do it," replied the gazelle. "I am quite willing to stay here. The grass is green, and the water clear. But if I were you, I should take the advice that was given me and ride the snail." So, though it did not please him at all, the prince took the gazelle in his arms, and mounted upon the back of the snail, which glided along very peaceably, entirely declining to be hurried by frequent blows from the prince's heels. In vain did the gazelle represent to him that she was enjoying herself very much, and that this was the easiest mode of conveyance she had ever discovered. Prince Vivien was wild with impatience, and thought that the green castle would never be reached. However, at last they did get there, and everyone who was in it ran to see the prince dismount from his singular steed. But what was his surprise when, having at her request set the gazelle gently down upon the steps which led up to the castle, he saw her suddenly change into a charming princess, and recognized in her his pretty cousin Placida, who greeted him with her usual tranquil sweetness. His delight knew no bounds, and he followed her eagerly up into the castle, impatient to know what strange events had brought her there. But after all, he had to wait for the princess's story, for the inhabitants of the green lands, hearing that the giant was dead, ran to offer the kingdom to his vanquisher. And Prince Vivien had to listen to various complimentary harangues, which took a great deal of time, though he cut them as short as politeness allowed, if not shorter. But at last he was free to rejoin Placida, who at once began the story of her adventures. "After you had gone away," said she, "they tried to make me learn how to govern the kingdom, which wearied me to death, so that I begged and prayed Lolotte to take me away with her, and this she presently did, but very reluctantly. However, having been transported to her grotto upon my favorite couch, I spent several delicious days, soothed by the soft green light, which was like a beech wood in the spring, and by the murmuring of bees and the tinkle of falling water. But alas, Lolotte was forced to go away to a general assembly of the fairies, and she came back in great dismay, telling me that her indulgence to me had cost her dear, for she had been severely reprimanded and ordered to hand me over to the fairy Mirlifiche, who was already taking charge of you, and who had been much commended for her management of you." "Fine management indeed," interrupted the prince. "If it is to her I owe all the adventures I have met with. But go on with your story, my cousin. I can tell you all about my doings afterwards, and then you can judge for yourself." "At first, I was grieved to see Lolotte cry," resumed the princess, "but I soon found that grieving was very troublesome, so I thought it better to be calm. And very soon afterwards, I saw the fairy Mirlifiche arrive, mounted upon her great unicorn. She stopped before the grotto and bade Lolotte bring me out to her, at which she cried worse than ever, and kissed me 12 times, but she dared not refuse. I was lifted up onto the unicorn behind Mirlifiche, who said to me, 'Hold on tight, little girl, if you don't want to break your neck." And indeed, I had to hold on with all my might, for her horrible steed trotted so violently that it positively took my breath away. However, at last we stopped at a large farm, and the farmer and his wife ran out as soon as they saw the fairy and helped us to dismount. I knew that they were really a king and queen, whom the fairies were punishing for their ignorance and idleness. You may imagine that I was by this time half dead with fatigue, but Mirlifiche insisted upon my feeding her unicorn before I did anything else. To accomplish this, I had to climb up a long ladder into the hayloft and bring down, one after another, 24 handfuls of hay. Never before did I have such a wearisome task. It makes me shudder to think of it now. And that was not all. In the same way, I had to carry the 24 handfuls of hay to the stable, and then it was supper time, and I had to wait upon all the others. After that, I really thought I should be allowed to go peaceably to my little bed, but oh dear no. First of all, I had to make it, for it was all in confusion. And then I had to make one for the fairy, and tuck her in, and draw the curtains round her, beside rendering her a dozen little services, which I was not at all accustomed to. Finally, when I was perfectly exhausted by all this toil, I was free to go to bed myself. But as I had never before undressed myself, and really did not know how to begin, I lay down as I was. Unfortunately, the fairy found this out, and just as I was falling into a sweet slumber, she made me get up once more. But even then, I managed to escape her vigilance, and only took off my upper robe. Indeed, I may tell you in confidence that I always find disobedience answer very well. One is often scolded, it is true, but then one has been saved some trouble. At the earliest dawn of day, Mirlifiche woke me and made me take many journeys to the stable to bring her word how her unicorn had slept, and how much hay he had eaten, and then to find out what time it was, and if it was a fine day. I was so slow, and did my errands so barely, that before she left, she called the king and queen, and said to them, "I am much more pleased with you this year. Continue to make the best of your farm, if you wish to get back to your kingdom. And also take care of this little princess for me, and teach her to be useful, that when I come, I may find her cured of her faults. If she is not—" Here she broke off with a significant look, and mounting my enemy, the unicorn, speedily disappeared. Then the king and queen, turning to me, asked me what I could do. "Nothing at all, I assure you," I replied in a tone which really ought to have convinced them, but they went on to describe various employments and tried to discover which of them would be most to my taste. However, At last, I persuaded them that to do nothing whatever would be the only thing that would suit me, and that if they really wanted to be kind to me, they would let me go to bed and to sleep, and not tease me about doing anything. To my great joy, they not only permitted this, but actually, when they had their own meals, the queen brought my portion up to me. But early the next morning, she appeared at my bedside, saying with an apologetic air, "My pretty child, I am afraid you must really make up your mind to get up today. I know quite well how delightful it is to be thoroughly idle, for when my husband and I were king and queen, we did nothing at all from morning to night. And I sincerely hope that it will not be long before those happy days will come again for us. But at present, we have not reached them, nor have you. And you know from what the fairy said that perhaps worse things may happen to us if she is not obeyed. Make haste, I beg of you, and come down to breakfast, for I have put by some delicious cream for you." It was really very tiresome, but as there was no help for it, I went down. But the instant breakfast was over, they began again their cuckoo cry of, "What will you do?" In vain did I answer, "Nothing at all, if it please you, madam." The queen at last gave me a spindle and about 4 pounds of hemp upon a distaff, and sent me out to keep the sheep, assuring me that there could not be a pleasanter occupation, and that I could take my ease as much as I pleased. I was forced to set out, very unwillingly, as you may imagine, but I had not walked far before I came to a shady bank in what seemed to me a charming place. I stretched myself cozily upon the soft grass, and with the bundle of hemp for a pillow, slept as tranquilly as if there were no such things as sheep in the world, while they, for their part, wandered hither and thither at their own sweet will, as if there were no such thing as a shepherdess, invading every field and browsing upon every kind of forbidden dainty, until the peasants, alarmed by the havoc they were making, raised a clamor, which at last reached the ears of the king and queen, who ran out, and seeing the cause of the commotion, hastily collected their flock, and indeed, the sooner the better, since they had to pay for all the damage they had done. As for me, I lay still and watched them run, for I was very comfortable, and there I might be still if they had not come up, all panting and breathless, and compelled me to get up and follow them. They also reproached me bitterly, but I need hardly tell you that they did not again entrust me with the flock. But whatever they found for me to do, it was always the same thing. I spoiled and mismanaged it all, and was so successful in provoking even the most patient people that one day I ran away from the farm, for I was really afraid the queen would be obliged to beat me when I came to the little river in which the king used to fish. I found the boat tied to a tree, and stepping in, I unfastened it and floated gently down with the current. The gliding of the boat was so soothing that I did not trouble myself in the least when the queen caught sight of me and ran along the bank, crying, "My boat! My boat! Husband, come and catch the little princess who is running away with my boat." The current soon carried me out of hearing of her cries, and I dreamed to the song of the ripples and the whisper of the trees until the boat suddenly stopped, and I found it was stuck fast beside a fresh green meadow, and that the sun was rising. In the distance, I saw some little houses which seemed to be built in a most singular fashion. But as I was by this time very hungry, I set out towards them. But before I had walked many steps, I saw that the air was full of shining objects which seemed to be fixed, and yet I could not see what they hung from. I went nearer and saw a silken cord hanging down to the ground, and pulled it just because it was so close to my hand. Instantly, the whole meadow resounded to the melodious chiming of a peal of silver bells, and they sounded so pretty that I sat down to listen and to watch them as they swung shining in the sunbeams. Before they ceased to sound came a great flight of birds, and each one, perching upon a bell, added its charming song to the concert. As they ended, I looked up and saw a tall and stately dame advancing towards me, surrounded and followed by a vast flock of every kind of bird. "Who are you, little girl," said she, "who dares to come where I allow no mortal to live, lest my birds should be disturbed? Still, if you are clever at anything," she added, "I might be able to put up with your presence." "Madam," I answered, rising, "you may be very sure that I shall not do anything to alarm your birds. I only beg you, for pity's sake, to give me something to eat." "I will do that," she replied, "before I send you where you deserve to go." And thereupon she dispatched 6 jays, who were her pages, to fetch me all sorts of biscuits, while some of the other birds brought ripe fruits. In fact, I had a delicious breakfast, though I do not like to be waited upon so quickly. It is so disagreeable to be hurried. I began to think I should like very well to stay in this pleasant country, and I said so to the stately lady. But she answered with the greatest disdain, "Do you think I would keep you here? You? Why, what do you suppose would be the good of you in this country, where everybody is wide awake and busy? No, no, I have shown you all the hospitality you will get from me." With these words, she turned and gave a vigorous pull to the silken rope, which I mentioned before. But instead of a melodious chime, there arose a hideous clanging, which quite terrified me, and in an instant a huge black bird appeared, which alighted at the fairy's feet, saying in a frightful voice, "What do you want of me, my sister? I wish you to take this little princess to my cousin, the giant of the green castle, at once," she replied, "and beg him from me to make her work day and night upon his beautiful tapestry." At these words, the great bird snatched me up, regardless of my cries, and flew off at a terrific pace. "Oh, you are joking, cousin," interrupted Prince Vivien. "You mean as slowly as possible. I know that horrible black bird, and the lengthiness of all his proceedings and surroundings." "Have it your own way," replied Placida tranquilly. "I cannot bear arguing. Perhaps this was not even the same bird. At any rate, he carried me off at a prodigious speed and set me gently down in this very castle of which you are now the master. We entered by one of the windows, and when the bird had handed me over to the giant from whom you have been good enough to deliver me, and given the fairy's message, it departed. Then the giant turned to me, saying, "So you are an idler. Ah, well, we must teach you to work. You won't be the first we have cured of laziness. See how busy all my guests are." I looked up as he spoke and saw that an immense gallery ran all round the hall, in which were tapestry frames, spindles, skeins of wool, patterns, and all necessary things. Before each frame, about a dozen people were sitting, hard at work, at which terrible sight I fainted away, and as soon as I recovered, they began to ask me what I could do. It was in vain that I replied as before, and with the strongest desire to be taken at my word. Nothing at all. Oh. The giant only said, "Then you must learn to do something. In this world, there is enough work for everybody." It appeared that they were working into the tapestry all the stories the fairies liked best, and they began to try and teach me to help them. But from the first class, where they tried me to begin with, I sank lower and lower, and not even the most simple stitches could I learn. In vain they punished me by all the usual methods. In vain the giant showed me his menagerie, which was entirely composed of children who would not work. Nothing did me any good, and at last I was reduced to drawing water for the dyeing of the wools. And even over that, I was so slow that this morning the giant flew into a rage and changed me into a gazelle. He was just putting me into the menagerie when I happened to catch sight of a dog, and was seized with such terror that I fled away at my utmost speed and escaped through the outer court of the castle. The giant, fearing that I should be lost altogether, sent his green lion after me, with orders to bring me back cost what it might. And I should certainly have let myself be caught, or eaten up, or anything, rather than run any further, if I had not luckily met you by the fountain. And oh, concluded the princess, how delightful it is once more to be able to sit still in peace. I was so tired of trying to learn things. Prince Vivien said that, for his part, he had been kept a great deal too still, and had not found it at all amusing. And then he recounted all his adventures with breathless rapidity, how he had taken shelter with Dame Patience, and consulted the oracle, and voyaged in the paper ship. Then they went hand in hand to release all the prisoners in the castle, and all the princes and princesses who were in cages in the menagerie. For the instant the green giant was dead, they had resumed their natural forms. As you may imagine, they were all very grateful. And Princess Placida entreated them never, never to do another stitch of work so long as they lived. And they promptly made a great bonfire in the courtyard, and solemnly burnt all the embroidery frames and spinning wheels. Then the princess gave them splendid presents, or rather sat by while Prince Vivien gave them, and there were great rejoicings in the green castle, and everyone did his best to please the prince and princess. But with all their good intentions, they often made mistakes. For Vivien and Placida were never of one mind about their plans, so it was very confusing, and they frequently found themselves obeying the prince's orders, very, very slowly, and rushing off with lightning speed to do something that the princess did not wish to have done at all, until, by and by, the two cousins took to consulting with and consoling one another in all these little vexations, and at last came to be so fond of each other that for Placida's sake Vivien became quite patient, and for Vivien's sake Placida made the most unheard of exertions. But now the fairies, who had been watching all these proceedings with interest, thought it was time to interfere and ascertain by further trials if this improvement was likely to continue, and if they really loved one another. So they caused Placida to seem to have a violent fever, and Vivien to languish and grow dull, and made each of them very uneasy about the other. And then, finding a moment when they were apart, the fairy Mirlifique suddenly appeared to Placida and said, "I have just seen Prince Vivien, and he seemed to me to be very ill." "Alas, yes, madam," she answered, "and if you will but cure him, you may take me back to the farm, or bring the green giant to life again, and you shall see how obedient I will be." "If you really wish him to recover," said the fairy, "you have only to catch the trotting mouse and the chaffinch on the wing and bring them to me. Only remember that time presses." She had hardly finished speaking before the princess was rushing headlong out of the castle gate, and the fairy, after watching her till she was lost to sight, gave a little chuckle and went in search of the prince, who begged her earnestly to send him back to the Black Castle, or to the paper boat, if she would but save Placida's life. The fairy shook her head and looked very grave. She quite agreed with him. The princess was in a bad way. "But," said she, "if you can find the rosy mole and give him to her, she will recover." So now it was the prince's turn to set off in a vast hurry. Only as soon as he left the castle, he happened to go in exactly the opposite direction to the one Placida had taken. Now you can imagine these two devoted lovers hunting night and day. The princess in the woods, always running, always listening, pursuing hotly after two creatures which seemed to her very hard to catch, which she yet never ceased from pursuing. The prince, on the other hand, wandering continually across the meadows, his eyes fixed upon the ground, attentive to every movement among the moles. He was forced to walk slowly, slowly upon tiptoe, hardly venturing to breathe. Often he stood for hours, motionless as a statue, and if the desire to succeed could have helped him, he would soon have possessed the rosy mole. But alas, all that he caught were black and ordinary, though strange to say, he never grew impatient, but always seemed ready to begin the tedious hunt again. But this changing of character is one of the most ordinary miracles which love works. Neither the prince nor the princess gave a thought to anything but their quest. It never even occurred to them to wonder what country they had reached. So you may guess how astonished they were one day when, having at last been successful after their long and weary chase, they cried aloud at the same instant, "At last I have saved my beloved." And then, recognizing each other's voice, looked up and rushed to meet one another with the wildest joy. Surprise kept them silent, while for one delicious moment they gazed into each other's eyes. And just then, who should come up but King Gridolin? For it was into his kingdom they had accidentally strayed. He recognized them in his turn and greeted them joyfully. But when they turned afterwards to look for the rosy mole, the chaffinch, and the trotting mouse, they had vanished. And in their places stood a lovely lady whom they did not know, the black bird and the green giant. King Gridolin had no sooner set eyes upon the lady than with a cry of joy he clasped her in his arms. For it was no other than his long-lost wife, Santorina, about whose imprisonment in fairyland you may perhaps read some day. Then the black bird and the green giant resumed their natural form, for they were enchanters. And up flew Lolotte and Mirlifiche in their chariots. And then there was a great kissing and congratulating, for everybody had regained someone he loved, including the enchanters, who loved their natural forms dearly. After this, they repaired to the palace, and the wedding of Prince Vivien and Princess Placida was held at once with all the splendor imaginable. King Gridolin and Queen Santorina, after all their experiences, had no further desire to reign, so they retired happily to a peaceful place, leaving their kingdom to the prince and princess, who were beloved by all their subjects, and found their greatest happiness all their lives long in making other people happy. Little One Eye, Little Two Eyes, and Little Three Eyes. There was once a woman who had 3 daughters, of whom the eldest was called Little One Eye, because she had only one eye in the middle of her forehead, and the second, Little Two Eyes, because she had 2 eyes like other people, and the youngest, Little Three Eyes, because she had 3 eyes. And her third eye was also in the middle of her forehead. But because Little Two Eyes did not look any different from other children, her sisters and mother could not bear her. They would say to her, "You, with your 2 eyes, are no better than common folk. You don't belong to us." They pushed her here and threw her wretched clothes there, and gave her to eat only what they left, and they were as unkind to her as ever they could be. It happened one day that Little Two Eyes had to go out into the fields to take care of the goat. But she was still quite hungry, because her sisters had given her so little to eat. So she sat down in the meadow and began to cry. And she cried so much that 2 little brooks ran out of her eyes. But when she looked up once in her grief, there stood a woman beside her, who asked, "Little Two Eyes, what are you crying for?" Little Two Eyes answered, "Have I not reason to cry? Because I have 2 eyes, like other people. My sisters and my mother cannot bear me. They push me out of one corner into another, and give me nothing to eat except what they leave. Today they have given me so little that I am still quite hungry." Then the wise woman said, "Little Two Eyes, dry your eyes, and I will tell you something so that you need never be hungry again. Only say to your goat, 'Little goat, bleat, little table appear,' and a beautifully spread table will stand before you with the most delicious food on it, so that you can eat as much as you want. And when you have had enough and don't want the little table anymore, you have only to say, 'Little goat, bleat, little table away,' and then it will vanish." Then the wise woman went away. But Little Two Eyes thought, "I must try at once if what she has told me is true, for I am more hungry than ever. And she said, "Little goat, bleat, little table appear." And scarcely had she uttered the words, when there stood a little table before her, covered with a white cloth, on which were arranged a plate, with a knife and fork and a silver spoon, and the most beautiful dishes, which were smoking hot, as if they had just come out of the kitchen. Then Little Two Eyes said the shortest grace she knew, and set to work, and made a good dinner. And when she had had enough, she said, as the wise woman had told her, "Little goat, bleat, little table, away." And immediately the table and all that was on it disappeared again. "That is a splendid way of housekeeping," thought Little Two Eyes, and she was quite happy and contented. In the evening, when she went home with her goat, she found a little earthenware dish with the food that her sisters had thrown to her, but she did not touch it. The next day, she went out again with her goat, and left the few scraps which were given her. The first and second times, her sisters did not notice this, but when it happened continually, they remarked it and said, "Something is the matter with Little Two Eyes, for she always leaves her food now, and she used to gobble up all that was given her. She must have found other means of getting food." So in order to get at the truth, Little One Eye was told to go out with Little Two Eyes when she drove the goat to pasture, and to notice particularly what she got there, and whether anyone brought her food and drink. Now, when Little Two Eyes was setting out, Little One Eye came up to her and said, "I will go into the field with you and see if you take good care of the goat, and if you drive him properly to get grass." But Little Two Eyes saw what Little One Eye had in her mind, and she drove the goat into the long grass and said, "Come, Little One Eye, we will sit down here, and I will sing you something." Little One Eye sat down, and as she was very much tired by the long walk to which she was not used, and by the hot day, and as Little Two Eyes went on singing, "Little One Eye, are you awake? Little One Eye, are you asleep?" She shut her one eye and fell asleep. When Little Two Eyes saw that Little One Eye was asleep and could find out nothing, she said, "Little goat, bleat, little table, appear," and sat down at her table and ate and drank as much as she wanted. Then she said again, "Little goat, bleat, little table, away." And in the twinkling of an eye, all had vanished. Little Two Eyes then woke Little One Eye and said, "Little One Eye, you meant to watch, and instead you went to sleep. In the meantime, the goat might have run far and wide. Come, we will go home." So they went home, and Little Two Eyes again left her little dish untouched, and Little One Eye could not tell her mother why she would not eat, and said as an excuse, "I was so sleepy out of doors." The next day, the mother said to Little Three Eyes, "This time you shall go with Little Two Eyes, and watch whether she eats anything out in the fields, and whether anyone brings her food and drink. For eat and drink she must secretly." So Little Three Eyes went to Little Two Eyes and said, "I will go with you and see if you take good care of the goat, and if you drive him properly to get grass." But Little Two Eyes knew what Little Three Eyes had in her mind, and she drove the goat out into the tall grass and said, "We will sit down here, Little Three Eyes, and I will sing you something." Little Three Eyes sat down. She was tired by the walk and the hot day, and Little Two Eyes sang the same little song again. "Little Three Eyes, are you awake?" But instead of singing as she ought to have done, "Little Three Eyes, are you asleep?" she sang without thinking. "Little Two Eyes, are you asleep?" She went on singing, "Little Three Eyes, are you awake? Little Two Eyes, are you asleep?" So that the two eyes of Little Three Eyes fell asleep. But the third, which was not spoken to in the little rhyme, did not fall asleep. Of course, Little Three Eyes shut that eye also out of cunning, to look as if she were asleep. But it was blinking and could see everything quite well. And when Little Two Eyes thought that Little Three Eyes was sound asleep, she said her rhyme, "Little goat, bleat, little table, appear," and ate and drank to her heart's content, and then made the table go away again by saying, "Little goat, bleat, little table, away." But Little Three Eyes had seen everything. Then Little Two Eyes came to her and woke her and said, "Well, Little Three Eyes, have you been asleep? You watch well. Come, we will go home." When they reached home, Little Two Eyes did not eat again. And Little Three Eyes said to the mother, "I know now why that proud thing eats nothing. When she says to the goat in the field, 'Little goat, bleat, little table, appear,' a table stands before her, spread with the best food, much better than we have. And when she has had enough, she says, 'Little goat, bleat, little table, away,' and everything disappears again. I saw it all exactly. She made 2 of my eyes go to sleep with a little rhyme, but the one in my forehead remained awake, luckily." Then the envious mother cried out, "Will you fare better than we do? You shall not have the chance to do so again." And she fetched a knife and killed the goat. When Little Two Eyes saw this, she went out full of grief, and sat down in the meadow and wept bitter tears. Then again the wise woman stood before her and said, "Little Two Eyes, what are you crying for?" "Have I not reason to cry?" she answered. "The goat, which, when I said the little rhyme, spread the table so beautifully, my mother has killed, and now I must suffer hunger and want again." The wise woman said, "Little Two Eyes, I will give you a good piece of advice. Ask your sisters to give you the heart of the dead goat and bury it in the earth before the house door. That will bring you good luck." Then she disappeared, and Little Two Eyes went home and said to her sisters, "Dear sisters, do give me something of my goat. I ask nothing better than its heart." Then they laughed and said, "You can have that if you want nothing more." And Little Two Eyes took the heart and buried it in the evening when all was quiet, as the wise woman had told her, before the house door. The next morning, when they all awoke and came to the house door, there stood a most wonderful tree, which had leaves of silver and fruit of gold growing on it. You never saw anything more lovely and gorgeous in your life. But they did not know how the tree had grown up in the night. Only Little Two Eyes knew that it had sprung from the heart of the goat, for it was standing just where she had buried it in the ground. Then the mother said to Little One Eye, "Climb up, my child, and break us off the fruit from the tree." Little One Eye climbed up, but just when she was going to take hold of one of the golden apples, the bough sprang out of her hands. And this happened every time, so that she could not break off a single apple, however hard she tried. Then the mother said, "Little Three Eyes, do you climb up? You with your 3 eyes can see round better than Little One Eye." So Little One Eye slid down, and Little Three Eyes climbed up. But she was not any more successful. Look round as she might, the golden apples bent themselves back. At last the mother got impatient and climbed up herself. But she was even less successful than Little One Eye and Little Three Eyes in catching hold of the fruit, and only grasped at the empty air. Then Little Two Eyes said, "I will just try once. Perhaps I shall succeed better." The sisters called out, "You with your 2 eyes will no doubt succeed." But Little Two Eyes climbed up, and the golden apples did not jump away from her, but behaved quite properly, so that she could pluck them off, one after the other, and brought a whole apronful down with her. The mother took them from her, and, instead of behaving better to poor Little Two Eyes, as they ought to have done, they were jealous that she only could reach the fruit, and behaved still more unkindly to her. It happened one day, that when they were all standing together by the tree, that a young knight came riding along. "Be quick, little Two Eyes," cried the two sisters. "Creep under this, so that you shall not disgrace us." And they put over poor little Two Eyes, as quickly as possible, an empty cask, which was standing close to the tree. And they pushed the golden apples, which she had broken off, under with her. When the knight, who was a very handsome young man, rode up, he wondered to see the marvelous tree of gold and silver, and said to the two sisters, "Whose is this beautiful tree? Whoever will give me a twig of it shall have whatever she wants." Then little One Eye and little Three Eyes answered that the tree belonged to them, and that they would certainly break him off a twig. They gave themselves a great deal of trouble, but in vain. The twigs and fruit bent back every time from their hands. Then the knight said, "It is very strange that the tree should belong to you, and yet that you have not the power to break anything from it." But they would have that the tree was theirs. And while they were saying this, little Two Eyes rolled a couple of golden apples from under the cask, so that they lay at the knight's feet. For she was angry with little One Eye and little Three Eyes for not speaking the truth. When the knight saw the apples, he was astonished and asked where they came from. Little One Eye and little Three Eyes answered that they had another sister, but she could not be seen because she had only 2 eyes, like ordinary people. But the knight demanded to see her and called out, "Little Two Eyes, come forth." Then little Two Eyes came out from under the cask quite happily, and the knight was astonished at her great beauty, and said, "Little Two Eyes, I am sure you can break me off a twig from the tree." "Yes," answered little Two Eyes, "I can, for the tree is mine." So she climbed up and broke off a small branch with its silver leaves and golden fruit without any trouble, and gave it to the knight. Then he said, "Little Two Eyes, what shall I give you for this?" "Ah," answered little Two Eyes, "I suffer hunger and thirst, want and sorrow, from early morning till late in the evening. If you would take me with you and free me from this, I should be happy." Then the knight lifted little Two Eyes on his horse and took her home to his father's castle. There he gave her beautiful clothes and food and drink. And because he loved her so much, he married her, and the wedding was celebrated with great joy. When the handsome knight carried little Two Eyes away with him, the 2 sisters envied her good luck at first. "But the wonderful tree is still with us, after all," they thought, "and although we cannot break any fruit from it, everyone will stop and look at it, and will come to us and praise it. Who knows whether we may not reap a harvest from it?" But the next morning the tree had flown, and their hopes with it. and when little Two Eyes looked out of her window, there it stood underneath, to her great delight. Little Two Eyes lived happily for a long time. Once 2 poor women came to the castle to beg alms. Then little Two Eyes looked at them and recognized both her sisters, little One Eye and little Three Eyes, who had become so poor that they came to beg bread at her door. But little Two Eyes bade them welcome, and was so good to them that they both repented from their hearts of having been so unkind to their sister. Jorinde and Joringel. There was once upon a time a castle in the middle of a thick wood where lived an old woman quite alone, for she was an enchantress. In the daytime, she changed herself into a cat or a night owl. But in the evening, she became like an ordinary woman again. She could entice animals and birds to come to her, and then she would kill and cook them. If any youth came within 100 paces of the castle, he was obliged to stand still, and could not stir from the spot till she set him free. But if a pretty girl came within this boundary, the old enchantress changed her into a bird, and shut her up in a wicker cage, which she put in one of the rooms in the castle. She had quite 7,000 of such cages in the castle, with very rare birds in them. Now, there was once a maiden called Jorinde, who was more beautiful than other maidens. She and a youth named Joringel, who was just as good-looking as she was, were betrothed to one another. Their greatest delight was to be together, and so that they might get a good long talk, they went one evening for a walk in the wood. "Take care," said Joringel, "not to come too close to the castle." It was a beautiful evening. The sun shone brightly between the stems of the trees among the dark green leaves of the forest, and the turtle dove sang clearly on the old may bushes. Jorinde wept from time to time, and she sat herself down in the sunshine and lamented. And Joringel lamented too. They felt as sad as if they had been condemned to die. They looked round and got quite confused, and did not remember which was their way home. Half the sun was still above the mountain, and half was behind it, when Joringel looked through the trees and saw the old wall of the castle quite near them. He was terrified and half dead with fright. Jorinde sang, "My little bird, with throat so red, sings sorrow, sorrow, sorrow. He sings to the little dove that's dead, sings sorrow, jug, jug, jug." Joringel looked up at Jorinde. She had been changed into a nightingale who was singing jug, jug. A night owl with glowing eyes flew 3 times round her and screeched 3 times, "To wit, to wit." To who?" Joringel could not stir. He stood there like a stone. He could not weep, or speak, or move hand or foot. Now the sun set. The owl flew into a bush, and immediately an old, bent woman came out of it. She was yellow-skinned and thin, and had large red eyes, and a hooked nose which met her chin. She muttered to herself, caught the nightingale, and carried her away in her hand. Joringel could say nothing. He could not move from the spot, and the nightingale was gone. At last the woman came back again, and said in a gruff voice, "Good evening, Zachiel. When the young moon shines in the basket, you are freed early, Zachiel." Then Joringel was free. He fell on his knees before the old woman and implored her to give him back his Jorinde. But she said he should never have her again, and then went away. He called after her. He wept and lamented, but all in vain. "What is to become of me?" he thought. Then he went away, and came at last to a strange village, where he kept sheep for a long time. He often went round the castle while he was there, but never too close. At last he dreamt one night that he had found a blood-red flower, which had in its center a beautiful large pearl. He plucked this flower and went with it to the castle, and there everything which he touched with the flower was freed from the enchantment, and he got his Jorinde back again through it. When he awoke in the morning, he began to seek mountain and valley to find such a flower. He sought it for 8 days, and on the 9th, early in the morning, he found the blood-red flower. In its center was a large dewdrop, as big as the most lovely pearl. He traveled day and night with this flower, till he arrived at the castle. When he came within 100 paces of it, he did not cease to be able to move, but he went on till he reached the gate. He was delighted at his success, touched the great gate with the flower, and it sprung open. He entered, passed through the courtyard, and then stopped to listen for the singing of the birds. At last he heard it. He went in and found the hall in which was the enchantress, and with her 7,000 birds in their wicker cages. When she saw Joringel, she was furious, and breathed out poison and gall at him, but she could not move a step towards him. He took no notice of her, and went and looked over the cages of birds, but there were many hundred nightingales, and how was he to find his Jorinde from among them? Whilst he was considering, he observed the old witch take up a cage secretly and go with it towards the door. Instantly, he sprang after her, touched the cage with the flower, and the old woman as well. Now she could no longer work enchantments, and there stood Jorinde before him, with her arms round his neck, and more beautiful than ever. Then he turned all the other birds again into maidens, and he went home with his Jorinde, and they lived a long and happy life. Allerleirauh, or the many-furred creature. There was once upon a time a king who had a wife with golden hair, and she was so beautiful that you couldn't find anyone like her in the world. It happened that she fell ill, and when she felt that she must soon die, she sent for the king and said, "If you want to marry after my death, make no one queen unless she is just as beautiful as I am, and has just such golden hair as I have. Promise me this." After the king had promised her this, she closed her eyes and died. For a long time, the king was not to be comforted, and he did not even think of taking a second wife. At last, his counselors said, "The king must marry again, so that we may have a queen." So messengers were sent far and wide to seek for a bride equal to the late queen in beauty. But there was no one in the wide world, and if there had been, she could not have had such golden hair. Then the messengers came home again, not having been able to find a queen. Now the king had a daughter who was just as beautiful as her dead mother, and had just such golden hair. One day, when she had grown up, her father looked at her and saw that she was exactly like her mother. So he said to his counselors, "I will marry my daughter to one of you, and she shall be queen, for she is exactly like her dead mother. And when I die, her husband shall be king." But when the princess heard of her father's decision, she was not at all pleased, and said to him, "Before I do your bidding, I must have 3 dresses, one as golden as the sun, one as silver as the moon, and one as shining as the stars. Besides these, I want a cloak made of 1,000 different kinds of skin. Every animal in your kingdom must give a bit of his skin to it." But she thought to herself, "This will be quite impossible, and I shall not have to marry someone I do not care for." The king, however, was not to be turned from his purpose, and he commanded the most skilled maidens in his kingdom to weave the 3 dresses, one as golden as the sun, and one as silver as the moon, and one as shining as the stars. And he gave orders to all his huntsmen to catch one of every kind of beast in the kingdom, and to get a bit of its skin to make the cloak of 1,000 pieces of fur. At last, when all was ready, the king commanded the cloak to be brought to him, and he spread it out before the princess and said, "Tomorrow shall be your wedding day." When the princess saw that there was no more hope of changing her father's resolution, she determined to flee away. In the night, when everyone else was sleeping, she got up and took 3 things from her treasures: a gold ring, a little gold spinning wheel, and a gold reel. She put the sun, moon, and star dresses in a nutshell, drew on the cloak of many skins, and made her face and hands black with soot. Then she commended herself to God, and went out and traveled the whole night till she came to a large forest. And as she was very much tired, she sat down inside a hollow tree and fell asleep. The sun rose, and she still slept on and on, although it was nearly noon. Now it happened that the king to whom this wood belonged was hunting in it. When his dogs came to the tree, they sniffed and ran round and round it, barking. The king said to the huntsman, "See what sort of a wild beast is in there." The huntsman went in, and then came back and said, "In the hollow tree there lies a wonderful animal that we don't know, and we have never seen one like it. Its skin is made of 1,000 pieces of fur, but it is lying down asleep." The king said, "See if you can catch it alive, and then fasten it to the cart, and we will take it with us." When the huntsmen seized the maiden, she awoke and was frightened, and cried out to them, "I am a poor child, forsaken by father and mother. Take pity on me, and let me go with you." Then they said to her, "Many-furred creature, you can work in the kitchen. Come with us and sweep the ashes together." So they put her in the cart, and they went back to the palace. There they showed her a tiny room under the stairs, where no daylight came, and said to her, "Many-furred creature, you can live and sleep here." Then she was sent into the kitchen, where she carried wood and water, poked the fire, washed vegetables, plucked fowls, swept up the ashes, and did all the dirty work. So the many-furred creature lived for a long time in great poverty. Ah, beautiful king's daughter, what is going to befall you now? It happened once, when a great feast was being held in the palace, that she said to the cook, "Can I go upstairs for a little bit and look on? I will stand outside the doors." The cook replied, "Yes, you can go up, but in half an hour you must be back here to sweep up the ashes." Then she took her little oil lamp and went into her little room, drew off her fur cloak, and washed off the soot from her face and hands, so that her beauty shone forth, and it was as if one sunbeam after another were coming out of a black cloud. Then she opened the nut and took out the dress as golden as the sun. And when she had done this, she went up to the feast, and everyone stepped out of her way for nobody knew her, and they thought she must be a king's daughter. But the king came towards her and gave her his hand, and danced with her, thinking to himself, "My eyes have never beheld anyone so fair." When the dance was ended, she curtsied to him, and when the king looked round, she had disappeared. No one knew whither. The guards who were standing before the palace were called and questioned, but no one had seen her. She had run to her little room and had quickly taken off her dress, made her face and hands black, put on the fur cloak, and was once more the many-furred creature. When she came into the kitchen and was setting about her work of sweeping the ashes together, the cook said to her, "Let that wait till tomorrow, and just cook the king's soup for me. I want to have a little peep at the company upstairs, but be sure that you do not let a hair fall into it. Otherwise you will get nothing to eat in future." So the cook went away, and the many-furred creature cooked the soup for the king. She made a bread soup as well as she possibly could, and when it was done, she fetched her gold ring from her little room and laid it in the tureen in which the soup was to be served up. When the dance was ended, the king had his soup brought to him and ate it, and it was so good that he thought he had never tasted such soup in his life. But when he came to the bottom of the dish, he saw a gold ring lying there, and he could not imagine how it got in. Then he commanded the cook to be brought before him. The cook was terrified when he heard the command, and said to the many-furred creature, "You must have let a hair fall into the soup. And if you have, you deserve a good beating." When he came before the king asked who had cooked the soup. The cook answered, "I cooked it." But the king said, "That's not true, for it was quite different and much better soup than you have ever cooked." Then the cook said, "I must confess, I did not cook the soup. The many-furred creature did." "Let her be brought before me," said the king. When the many-furred creature came, the king asked her who she was. "I am a poor child, without father or mother." Then he asked her, "What do you do in my palace?" "I am of no use except to have boots thrown at my head." "How did you get the ring which was in the soup?" he asked. "I know nothing at all about the ring," she answered. So the king could find out nothing, and was obliged to send her away. After a time, there was another feast, and the many-furred creature begged the cook, as at the last one, to let her go and look on. He answered, "Yes, but come back again in half an hour and cook the king the bread soup that he likes so much." So she ran away to her little room, washed herself quickly, took out of the nut the dress as silver as the moon, and put it on. Then she went upstairs, looking just like a king's daughter. And the king came towards her, delighted to see her again. And as the dance had just begun, they danced together. But when the dance was ended, she disappeared again so quickly that the king could not see which way she went. She ran to her little room and changed herself once more into the many-furred creature, and went into the kitchen to cook the bread soup. When the cook was upstairs, she fetched the golden spinning wheel and put it in the dish so that the soup was poured over it. It was brought to the king, who ate it and liked it as much as the last time. He had the cook sent to him, and again he had to confess that the many-furred creature had cooked the soup. Then the many-furred creature came before the king, but she said again that she was of no use except to have boots thrown at her head, and that she knew nothing at all of the golden spinning wheel. When the king had a feast for the third time, things did not turn out quite the same as at the other two. The cook said, "You must be a witch, many-furred creature, for you always put something in the soup, so that it is much better and tastes nicer to the king than any that I cook." But because she begged hard, he let her go up for the usual time. Now she put on the dress as shining as the stars and stepped into the hall in it. The king danced again with the beautiful maiden and thought she had never looked so beautiful. And while he was dancing, he put a gold ring on her finger without her seeing it, and he commanded that the dance should last longer than usual. When it was finished, he wanted to keep her hands in his, but she broke from him and sprang so quickly away among the people that she vanished from his sight. She ran as fast as she could to her little room under the stairs, but because she had stayed too long beyond the half-hour, she could not stop to take off the beautiful dress, but only threw the fur cloak over it. And in her haste, she did not make herself quite black with the soot, one finger remaining white. The many-furred creature now ran into the kitchen, cooked the king's bread soup, and when the cook had gone, she laid the gold reel in the dish. When the king found the reel at the bottom, he had the many-furred creature brought to him, and then he saw the white finger and the ring which he had put on her hand in the dance. Then he took her hand and held her tightly, and as she was trying to get away, she undid the fur cloak a little bit, and the star dress shone out. The king seized the cloak and tore it off her. Her golden hair came down, and she stood there in her full splendor and could not hide herself away any more. And when the soot and ashes had been washed from her face, she looked more beautiful than anyone in the world. But the king said, "You are my dear bride, and we will never be separated from one another." So the wedding was celebrated, and they lived happily ever after. The 12 Huntsmen. Once upon a time, there was a king's son who was engaged to a princess whom he dearly loved. One day, as he sat by her side, feeling very happy, he received news that his father was lying at the point of death and desired to see him before his end. So he said to his love, "Alas, I must go off and leave you. But take this ring and wear it as a remembrance of me. And when I am king, I will return and fetch you home." Then he rode off, and when he reached his father, he found him mortally ill and very near death. The king said, "Dearest son, I have desired to see you again before my end. Promise me, I beg of you, that you will marry according to my wishes." And he then named the daughter of a neighboring king, who he was anxious should be his son's wife. The prince was so overwhelmed with grief that he could think of nothing but his father, and exclaimed, "Yes, yes, dear father, whatever you desire shall be done." Thereupon the king closed his eyes and died after the prince had been proclaimed king, and the usual time of mourning had elapsed. He felt that he must keep the promise he had made to his father. So he sent to ask for the hand of the king's daughter, which was granted to him at once. Now, his first love heard of this, and the thought of her lover's desertion grieved her so sadly that she pined away and nearly died. Her father said to her, "My dearest child, why are you so unhappy? If there is anything you wish for, say so, and you shall have it." His daughter reflected for a moment, and then said, "Dear father, I wish for 11 girls as nearly as possible of the same height, age, and appearance as myself." Said the king, "If the thing is possible, your wish shall be fulfilled." And he had his kingdom searched till he found 11 maidens of the same height, size, and appearance as his daughter. Then the princess desired 12 complete huntsmen's suits to be made, all exactly alike, and the 11 maidens had to dress themselves in 11 of the suits, while she herself put on the 12th. After this, she took leave of her father, and rode off with her girls to the court of her former lover. Here she inquired whether the king did not want some huntsmen, and if he would not take them all into his service. The king saw her, but did not recognize her, and as he thought them very good-looking young people, he said, yes, he would gladly engage them all. So they became the 12 royal huntsmen. Now, the king had a most remarkable lion, for it knew every hidden or secret thing. One evening, the lion said to the king, "So you think you have got 12 huntsmen, do you?" "Yes, certainly," said the king. "They are 12 huntsmen." "There you are mistaken," said the lion. "They are 12 maidens." "That cannot possibly be," replied the king. "How do you mean to prove that?" "Just have a number of peas strewed over the floor of your antechamber," said the lion, "and you will soon see. Men have a strong, firm tread, so that if they happen to walk over peas, not one will stir. But girls trip and slip and slide, so that the peas roll all about." The king was pleased with the lion's advice and ordered the peas to be strewn in his anteroom. Fortunately, one of the king's servants had become very partial to the young huntsmen, and hearing of the trial they were to be put to, he went to them and said, "The lion wants to persuade the king that you are only girls," and then told them all the plot. The king's daughter thanked him for the hint, and after he was gone, she said to her maidens, "Now make every effort to tread firmly on the peas." Next morning, when the king sent for his 12 huntsmen, and they passed through the anteroom, which was plentifully strewn with peas, they trod so firmly and walked with such a steady, strong step that not a single pea rolled away or even so much as stirred. After they were gone, the king said to the lion, "There now, you have been telling lies. You see yourself, they walk like men." "Because they knew they were being put to the test," answered the lion, "and so they made an effort. But just have a dozen spinning wheels placed in the anteroom. When they pass through, you'll see how pleased they will be, quite unlike any man." The king was pleased with the advice and desired 12 spinning wheels to be placed in his antechamber. But the good-natured servant went to the huntsmen and told them all about this fresh plot. Then, as soon as the king's daughter was alone with her maidens, she exclaimed, "Now, pray make a great effort, and don't even look at those spinning wheels." When the king sent for his 12 huntsmen next morning, they walked through the anteroom without even casting a glance at the spinning wheels. Then the king said once more to the lion, "You have deceived me again. They are men, for they never once looked at the spinning wheels." The lion replied, "They knew they were being tried, and they did violence to their feelings." But the king declined to believe in the lion any longer. So the 12 huntsmen continued to follow the king, and he grew daily fonder of them. One day, whilst they were all out hunting, it so happened that news was brought that the king's intended bride was on her way and might soon be expected. When the true bride heard of this, she felt as though a knife had pierced her heart, and she fell fainting to the ground. The king, fearing something had happened to his dear huntsman, ran up to help and began drawing off his gloves. Then he saw the ring which he had given to his first love, and as he gazed into her face, he knew her again, and his heart was so touched that he kissed her. and as she opened her eyes, he cried, "I am thine, and thou art mine, and no power on earth can alter that." To the other princess, he dispatched a messenger to beg her to return to her own kingdom with all speed. "For," said he, "I have got a wife, and he who finds an old key again does not require a new one." Thereupon the wedding was celebrated with great pomp, and the lion was restored to the royal favor, for after all, he had told the truth. Spindle, shuttle, and needle. Once upon a time, there lived a girl who lost her father and mother when she was quite a tiny child. Her godmother lived all alone in a little cottage at the far end of the village, and there she earned her living by spinning, weaving, and sewing. The old woman took the little orphan home with her and brought her up in good, pious, industrious habits. When the girl was 15 years old, her godmother fell ill, and calling the child to her bedside, she said, "My dear daughter, I feel that my end is near. I leave you my cottage, which will, at least, shelter you, and also my spindle, my weaver's shuttle, and my needle, with which to earn your bread." Then she laid her hands on the girl's head, blessed her, and added, "Mind and be good, and then all will go well with you." With that, she closed her eyes for the last time, and when she was carried to her grave, the girl walked behind her coffin, weeping bitterly, and paid her all the last honors. After this, the girl lived all alone in the little cottage. She worked hard, spinning, weaving, and sewing, and her old godmother's blessing seemed to prosper all she did. The flax seemed to spread and increase, and when she wove a carpet or a piece of linen or made a shirt, she was sure to find a customer who paid her well, so that not only did she feel no want herself, but she was able to help those who did. Now, it happened that about this time, the king's son was making a tour through the entire country to look out for a bride. He could not marry a poor woman, and he did not wish for a rich one. "She shall be my wife," said he, "who is at once the poorest and the richest." When he reached the village where the girl lived, he inquired who was the richest and who the poorest woman in it. The richest was named first. The poorest, he was told, was a young girl who lived alone in a little cottage at the far end of the village. The rich girl sat at her door, dressed out in all her best clothes. And when the king's son came near, she got up, went to meet him, and made him a low curtsy. He looked well at her, said nothing, but rode on further. When he reached the poor girl's house, he did not find her at her door, for she was at work in her room. The prince reined in his horse, looked in at the window through which the sun was shining brightly, and saw the girl sitting at her wheel, busily spinning away. She looked up, and when she saw the king's son gazing in at her, she blushed red all over, cast down her eyes, and span on. Whether the thread was quite as even as usual, I really cannot say. But she went on spinning till the king's son had ridden off. Then she stepped to the window and opened the lattice, saying, "The room is so hot." But she looked after him as long as she could see the white plumes in his hat. Then she sat down to her work once more and span on. And as she did so, an old saying, which she had often heard her godmother repeat whilst at work, came into her head, and she began to sing. "Spindle, spindle, go and see if my love will come to me. Lo, and behold, the spindle leapt from her hand and rushed out of the room. And when she had sufficiently recovered from her surprise to look after it, she saw it dancing merrily through the fields, dragging a long golden thread after it. And soon it was lost to sight. The girl, having lost her spindle, took up the shuttle, and seating herself at her loom, began to weave. Meantime, the spindle danced on, and just as it had come to the end of the golden thread, it reached the king's son. "What do I see?" he cried. "This spindle seems to wish to point out the way to me." So he turned his horse's head and rode back beside the golden thread. Meantime, the girl sat weaving and sang, "Shuttle, weave both web and woof. Bring my love beneath my roof." The shuttle instantly escaped from her hand, and with one bound was out at the door. On the threshold it began weaving the loveliest carpet that was ever seen. Roses and lilies bloomed on both sides, and in the center a thicket seemed to grow with rabbits and hares running through it, stags and fawns peeping through the branches, whilst on the topmost boughs sat birds of brilliant plumage, and so lifelike one almost expected to hear them sing. The shuttle flew from side to side, and the carpet seemed almost to grow of itself. As the shuttle had run away, the girl sat down to sew. She took her needle and sang, "Needle, needle, stitch away, make my chamber bright and gay." And the needle promptly slipped from her fingers and flew about the room like lightning. You would have thought invisible spirits were at work, for in next to no time the table and benches were covered with green cloth, the chairs with velvet, and elegant silk curtains hung before the windows. The needle had barely put in its last stitch when the girl, glancing at the window, spied the white-plumed hat of the king's son, who was being led back by the spindle with the golden thread. He dismounted and walked over the carpet into the house, And when he entered the room, there stood the girl, blushing like any rose. "You are the poorest, and yet the richest," said he. "Come with me, you shall be my bride." She said nothing, but she held out her hand. Then he kissed her, and led her out, lifted her on his horse, and took her to his royal palace, where the wedding was celebrated with great rejoicings. The spindle, the shuttle, and the needle were carefully placed in the treasury, and were always held in the very highest honor.